My name is Frank Redmond, and I'm a program manager on the CommPlus team, and I'm here to give you some idea of what's coming down the road in terms of CommPlus futures. So new features and services that we add in the CommPlus, specifically in like the Whistler time frame. So everything that you see here will be in the box in Whistler. Quite simply, the goal of CommPlus 1.x is we just want to add more services to make it easier for you to increase the overall scalability, availability, and manageability of your CommPlus 1.0 applications. All right, that's essentially what we want to do, add new services that you can use to increase scalability and manageability and all these good things. So we're going to follow that kind of line of thinking and talk specifically about what enhancements we're providing for scalability, what are we doing for availability, and what are we doing for increased manageability. And I don't just, when I say manageability, I'm not just talking about like from the administrator perspective, but also from, developer perspective in terms of writing code, making the whole process of designing and building component-based applications a lot more manageable. And since this is kind of a small group, I would actually like to take questions interactively, since this is such a small group. So if you got a question, just raise your hand and we'll just do it like that. Cool. So in terms of scalability enhancements, we'll talk about two things specifically: process recycling and configurable isolation levels. The problem that we want to solve with process recycling is simply this one. As you write more and more code, right? Writing code is not a perfect science, right? There's going to be bugs associated with code that you write, right? In reliance on third-party code that you can't test or that you didn't write. People using resources in non-scalable ways. Right? Memory leaks, like things of this nature just occur. And the fact that they occur is not so big a problem. It's just that over time, right, if your application starts on Sunday and runs for a month, right, over time this application is constantly running, a small memory leak becomes a huge problem. Right? Using a resource in a non-scalable way may not be a small problem, may not be a big problem like for 1 or 2 days, but as you run this application longer and longer, that problem manifests itself in an exponential problem. So the solution is quite simply, if you could shut down your application and restart it in some controlled manner, right? That would fix a lot of these problems that exist in terms of memory leaks that you already know about. And would also solve some of these other unknown problems that you aren't aware of yet or that have not manifested themselves. Right? So recycling the process is a way to solve known problems and to guard against unknown problems, right? So it's kind of like a prophylactic for your application, right? You don't want to have these problems going all over the place, right? That's the basic premise of process recycling. So we want to shut this application down and restart it, right? Well, here's a lot of different ways, a lot of different reasons we might want to recycle an application, right? So you go into the admin SDK and you configure this service, and then like transactions and a lot of these other services, it's a service that's automatically provided for you by the system. Okay, so you don't have to write a lot of code to make it happen. You just configure the application to use the service, and then we actually provide the service for you. So what are some of the reasons that you might want to have a process recycled or an application be recycled? Right, so wall clock lifetime limit, right? Elapsed time. After 24 hours, I just want to recycle the application. Right? That's a common scenario. A number of calls. After 1,000 calls, I want to recycle it. And activation limits. After so many activations, recycle this process. To prevent rogue applications from just running away with memory, right? You want to have a high watermark in terms of memory. Right? If you see the application using more than this much memory, I want you to recycle that application. Right? So these are some of the common problems or some of the ways you can configure your application to be recycled. This last one, recycle expiration timeout, I'll talk specifically about what that is in just a second. But just understand right now that you go into the admin SDK and you configure on a per application basis reasons why you would want to have that process be recycled. Go ahead.
How are those events surfaced into the event log and so forth? Do you have to easily wait latency over that?
Sure. So his question is, how do we handle notification of a process being recycled or something like that, if in case you want to write an entry into the event log or some application wants to know when another process or application gets recycled, how do you deal with that? Is that essentially your question?
Yeah, and also is it utilizing WMI as well at this time?
At this time, we do not use WMI, right? But I'll show you specifically some things you can do in just a second in terms of event notification. So I've got this application. I configure a bunch of these settings in terms of why I would want to recycle an application. And then what happens under the cover when you go to recycle it is you can get a a reference to the COM admin catalog, right? And then you can get a specific instance ID from an app ID and then just say, I want to recycle that process. Okay, so if you want to write code to manually go in and recycle a process, here's what is happening. You get an instance ID from an app ID and then you say recycle this process using that instance ID. And you specify the reason that you want to recycle the application. Right, and these all just go back to those reasons that I specified on the page, on the earlier page, right? Lifetime limitations, activation limit, or you can have one for no reason at all, right? Just I have an admin function that allows an administrator to recycle a process for no apparent reason, right? You might want to enable that functionality, and then you can say no reason supplied. So here's the part that I wanted to point out to this gentleman is that interested parties can be notified via COM+ events. Right? So for all those that don't know, COM+ events is the loosely coupled event mechanism. So it's a publish and subscribe event mechanism as opposed to connection points or VB with events. Right? So COM+ events is loosely coupled publish and subscribe as opposed to the very chatty, very connection-oriented eventing mechanism of like connection points or VB with events. So what ends up happening is people that want to know about particular processes being recycled can subscribe to this event. Okay, so they build a regular subscription like they do with any other COM+ event. And the event that they'll get notified is process recycled. And we'll tell you which application, which specific instance, and then we'll tell you why that application was recycled. So here again, if you wanted to take this and write a WMI log, or if you wanted to do something like in response to that, then this is where you'd be interested in this particular event notification. You just build a subscription and the system will call you back. Another reason that you might want to use this is we see process recycling being more of an infrastructure feature, right? So it's not a high-level app design kind of feature. If you wanted to build some other infrastructure on top of this, for example, IIS in the 6.0 time frame is going to take advantage of some of this technology, right? So they will build on top of that. That's a piece of system code that's going to use this. And so essentially the way we look at it is you want to respond to the event notification because that tells that particular subscriber, or that tells that client that they need to release any outstanding references that are being held to, components in that particular application. And I'll explain that in a little bit more in a second. So when you call recycle surrogate, here's a little idea just to give you some idea of what happens under the covers. So I have a DLL host that represents a COM+ application's address space. In this particular case, it's a server app. And you've got the COM+ system app mapped into that address space. And essentially, when you call recycle surrogate, we execute some code that essentially makes sure that that particular caller is an administrator. Okay? Then we jump down into this OLA32 call where we call recycle surrogate. Okay? And then specifically what we do is we mark that particular surrogate to be recycled, okay, in a certain period of time. And that's where that recycle expiration timeout property comes into play. So what we'll do is we'll mark that application to be recycled. Then on our next pass, when we sweep through these applications that are tagged to be recycled, we'll actually recycle them later. So there's this one stage where you just demarcate which one should be recycled. Then the recycling actually happens later. Okay? And then we fire this process recycled event. So when you get the process recycled event, that process is actually still alive. Okay? What then happens is we return from that call, and then we check that expiration timeout to see have all of the clients released their outstanding references, right? And if all of the references and all of the objects go to 0, right, and then the process should just go away naturally, just like you would expect any COM server to go away when all of the references get to 0. But if for some reason some client has not responded to the event to be notified that, hey, that process is about to be recycled, and they haven't released their outstanding references, which would mean that the process would stay alive, then we will actually go ahead and actively shoot that process and just tear it down. Right? So we want to have a controlled manner where we can notify people that it's about to shut down, you should release your references. But if people aren't well behaved and don't respond or don't do the right thing, we don't want the client to have any control over the recycling process. Right? We want them to participate, but we don't want them to control it, right, or prevent the recycling process from happening. So we will actively go ahead and kill the process if the expiration timeout is reached before everybody has a chance to release their references. Does that make sense? Cool.
So do new requests just queue up then while you're waiting for all the references to go away?
Do the requests queue up? Requests for what?
Requests to activate that object.
So in essence, if somebody marks a process to be recycled, what happens to incoming activation requests? Absolutely, that's a great question. His question is, if a process is marked to be recycled, and then somebody else that doesn't know that that process is about to be recycled calls co-create instance on some particular class ID that lives in that process, what kind of happens? We have some other system services that allow you to pause and disable activations, and we expose that directly, and I'll talk about that a little later. That we use that functionality internally now to disable any future activation requests that are coming in as part of the recycling process. So we will prevent new activations from coming in while our process is in the process of being recycled.
So they'll get a failed H result?
You'll get a failed H result, absolutely. Great question. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is this notion of configurable isolation levels. And I'll get to it in a second, but essentially isolation level, how many people here know what isolation level is, right, from the transaction perspective? Okay, great. So we'll just fly through this really quickly. Essentially, for those people that don't know, the isolation level is the extent to which changes outside of your transactions impact or are visible to your transactions. So in other words, if I'm in the middle of updating some data and somebody else from outside of my transaction also is updating that same data, how visible are those changes to my transaction, right? If they add a new row that affects my row set, can I see that? If they make modifications to the specific data that I'm working on, can I see that, right? Those are some of the things that isolation level you should be thinking about. A couple of other key points is that we achieve isolation level using locking mechanisms, right? And for people that know about scalability and throughput, you want to minimize locking as much as possible. So these locks are used to control whether your current transaction can see uncommitted data, okay? So this notion of dirty reads, whether other transactions can modify existing data before the current transaction ends, okay? Can they modify information that I'm working with at all before my transaction commits, right? And whether these other transactions can add new rows to that are reflected in my row set. So if you add some new data to the database, can I see that, right? So these are some of the things that we use locks to control. So here's a nice little chart that essentially has a column that's for each one of those attributes, right? Each one of those various properties of visibility, so to speak, right? And then we have this isolation level that is a name: read uncommitted, read committed, repeatable read, serializable. The point that you want to see here is that the lower the isolation level, the less locking there is, right? So the more people can get at the data because it's not locked as long, right? So that's a good thing. You want to use the lowest possible isolation level that you can. On the other side of the scale, the higher the isolation level, the more locking, right? And there's less concurrency. However, right, so there's less people touching the data, but there's a lower potential for incorrect data. And as you can see, if you look at the serializable, right, where everything is no, you can't have dirty reads, no, you can't have unrepeatable reads, no, there's no such thing as a phantom read. Essentially, we're going to lock everything. That's the most locking, serializable. Okay, the least amount of locking is read uncommitted, right? So serializable is essentially a way to guarantee or effectively guarantee accuracy of results. Okay, that's the key point that I want to bring out on that slide. Now we'll talk about the specific problem. COM plus 1.0 and MTS 1 and 2, like before it, use serializable as this level of isolation. Okay. We use serializable because effectively it's better for us to be safe than sorry with other people's data. We don't want people shooting themselves in the foot by using a lower level of isolation than they really need, right? Then you have this potential for incorrect results, and then PSS phone is ringing off the hook and people are saying it doesn't work right, right? So we use serializable as the default because it's just better to be safe than sorry from our perspective. But for a lot of applications, that's just overkill, right? For people that know exactly what isolation level is, they got, database experience, they know what that isolation level is all about, we are actually hampering them from getting the most amount of throughput that they can in their systems, right? So we want to have a way for people that know what they're doing to get more concurrency in the system, right? So we want to allow those people that know how to use and configure their isolation levels. And the way it works is you configure the isolation level on a per component basis, okay, just like transactions, right? You configure it on a per component basis. And the way it works is there's a setting, one for each one of those four, and there's also another setting called any, which is essentially, hey, I don't know anything really about it, and any one of those isolation levels is as good as the next. Okay. The thing you should think about is that the root component of the transaction determines the isolation level for the entire transaction. Okay. Everybody here know what the root component is that I'm talking about? Okay, right. So the root component determines the isolation level for the entire transaction. Any other components that are created downstream, so if the root component co-creates some other components that participate in that transaction, they have to have an isolation level that matches or is lower than the isolation level of the root component. If you have an isolation level higher than that of the root component in a downstream component, you'll actually get an error with isolation level mismatch. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. Good.
For the downstream components, to determine the isolation level when you activate those, do you do that by requiring EPC, or do you do something in the context?
We do something in the context. Actually,
BYOT isn't going to work. So if I wanted to do something configurable so that the root would be left with any, it wouldn't help me create my own transaction and bring it along.
no. Great question. So if you do something with bring your own transaction where he's already got an isolation level configured outside, you've created this transaction someplace else, and you want to bring that in, that component that you bring in is going to get treated just like any other component that's downstream, right? The root component, if it's set to any, it'll actually default to serializable.
Even if you already had a transaction that wasn't serializable at that point.
Right, exactly.
So how do you detect that? When you enlist, you just fail to enlist?
When the component with the BILT,
At that point, your root component tries to enlist the transaction you're bringing, does it just fail?
when the root component tries to enlist in a transaction, will it just fail? No, the root component, so what we do is when we create the root component, we actually look up for that particular component. We look in the COM catalog. We don't do anything with the transaction stream, if that's what you're trying to get to. We look in the configuration database, and we see what the isolation level for that particular component should be. Right? And at that point in time, if the transaction already exists, right, so if you already have a transaction context that exists with one higher than that, then we would just fail that because it's essentially an E-isolation level mismatch, just as if it were. Absolutely. Yep. So again, isolation level of any means that essentially any isolation level is okay. I'll use whatever my upstream caller is using. So again, if you had a component that was configured to be used in BYOT, if you used it with any, actually you have to pick it up off the transaction that's coming in, so it wouldn't even matter to you. It wouldn't work for you. Essentially, for people that aren't familiar with BYOT, just don't worry about that. So again, if you have isolation level of any on your component and it's the root component, then we will default to serializable. Okay. If you have a transaction isolation level of any on a downstream component, then obviously they're saying whatever the upstream component has configured is going to work for me. All right, so any works the way you would expect it to be. And again, the basic premise that we default, the basic reason that we default back to serializable is just for one, backward compatibility, and two, for the same reason that we made the initial choice to default to serializable, right? It's just better to be safe than sorry from our perspective. But for those developers that know, like my man in the back, for those developers that really know what isolation level is all about and want to get extra throughput and extra concurrency, or increased throughput and increased concurrency, then we allow them at least to configure the isolation level for their own needs. So again, so we've talked about kind of how it works. How do you use it? So again, if you're using the COM admin, if you're using the Component Services Explorer, it's just another property. It's a drop-down list box that you can use and set. I want it to be serializable. I want it to be any. Or if you're using an admin SDK, you can go component by component using the components collection and then navigate through the various components in a particular application. And it's just a new property called isolation level that you configure using enumeration. Right? So that's how you actually configure this to work. So it's another automatic service that we provide. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about things that we're doing in terms of trying to increase availability for these applications. And there's essentially two things here. One is for running applications as NT services, and the other one is the notion of memory gates. So today, if you want to have a COM+ application, you've written your code, you got this COM+ app, and you want to make it highly available. For example, you want to make it part of a Wolfpack cluster, Microsoft cluster server, right? So you've got this 2-node cluster or an N-node cluster, and you want to install your applications on here. It's a lot of times very beneficial to have these applications be able to run as NT services, right? Examples would be you want to be able to control the order in which your applications boot. You want to use local system account. And it's just a lot easier if these applications can be made to run as NT services, right? So this is one of the famous COM+ questions is, when I want my application to be started when the machine automatically boots or reboots, how do I do that, right? We get that question a lot. The answer, in short, is write an NT service, right? But then you have to write a lot more code to actually make an NT service. So what we're doing is actually providing a way for you to take a complex application, walk up to it in the Component Services Explorer, and simply say, I want to check a box to make that run as an NT service, provide a service name, and then you can control it just like you can any other service in the Service Control Manager. All right, so that's the basic premise here. Pretty simple. We talked about the reasons. Again, something that you just configure. It's an automatic service. There's a new property on the application that says I want this to run as a service, and then it has a service name that you specify. All right, so it's pretty simple, the reasons why and actually how you actually configure a complex application to run as a service. The next thing is this notion of memory gates. And the basic problem here is there's not enough memory on the box. At some point in time, the application runs, it uses more resources, it uses more memory, and you can get to a situation where there's enough memory on the box to actually create a component or to load the DLL server, but there's not enough memory effectively to do anything once that component is created. All right, so you can get into these really funky situations, really nasty situations that you have to unwind from. And quite simply, the better solution is to actually try to use memory gates to control whether or not you have enough memory to do something effectively and prevent the component creation if you can proactively. Right? Memory gates is something that we use inside of COM+, and we've been using them actually inside of MTS and COM+ for a while, and we decided to expose that to developers and let them know about what memory gates are and how we use them, right, as a benefit to the component developer. So the basic problem, again, is when you create these components in low memory situations, a lot of squirrely things can happen. Right? It's not enough memory to actually use it, but you've got enough memory to create it. So proactively, we want to disallow server component creation ahead of time when in these low memory situations. And the way this works is inside the SCUM, when somebody asks to create a particular component, obviously we've got interception code there to know, so we know when somebody wants to create a new component, and all we do is check the virtual memory. Right? And so there's two memory gates that you want to be aware of. One is one for actually loading the process. Right? And if there's greater than 90% of the virtual memory being used, we won't even allow the process to get loaded. Right? We will fail you with this E out of memory. That'll be your H result. Right? Then there's another specific memory gate for actually creating components. So once the server is loaded in memory, now I want to go create instances of components. Right? And if there's greater than 95% of the virtual memory being used in that scenario, then we will fail the object creation code again with E out of memory. Right? And these are unconfigurable. Right? It's hard-coded in the code for these scenarios. And again, both of these gates are checked in the Service Control Manager code. Questions? Question in the back? No? Cool. Now we'll get to the good stuff. The things we're doing to make, again, development of complex applications more manageable, that process, and the administration of complex applications more manageable. And think again in terms of like the hosted ASP scenario, right? So I've got an application service provider, some third party that maintains and runs my code, right? So I drop my code off to this ASP, people go there, and then they handle all the administration of the sites and that sort of thing, right? Of the applications themselves, right? I don't do that. I just develop them and drop them off to this ASP, this third party. So again, we kind of talked a little bit earlier about this notion of being able to pause and disable applications, right? In terms of process recycling, what happens if other activation requests are coming in the meantime while a process is in the recycling process, in the phase and process of being recycled, what happens to those requests? Well, quite simply, when we start that recycling process, we simply disable the application, right? So the incoming request will get failed. We'll see exactly how pause and disable works, but that's what that feature is all about. This notion of process dumping, alias components, public and private components, and then application partitions. So again, pausing and disabling applications, the basic problem here is I've got a complex application. Once I install it on the box, it's available for service. Right? It's either all available or none of it's available. I either uninstall it or I install it, and at which point it's always available. Right? I have no way to say I want it installed, but I want to disable activations on a per application basis or on a per component basis. Right? So I have very limited control of the activations. Essentially what we want to do is allow people to pause and disable these applications, right? Similar to pausing and disabling a service. Right? That's the basic premise. And the whole point is just to make these applications more manageable from the administrator's perspective. bunch of fine points, like detail points here. The basic premise is simple, obviously. Pause allows you to prevent future activations. People that have existing outstanding references, those are still valid, right? So we don't do anything with those. But future activations will be failed with e-app pause. Okay. This only works for COM+ server applications. And the inevitable questions of, does it work with library applications? Does it work with COM Classic applications? So let me just spell it out. It does not work with those. It only works with COM+ server applications. And again, once I've paused an application, I can walk up to the admin SDK, and I can walk up to a particular catalog, to the admin catalog, and say I want to pause a particular application. Right? And then it's just like the resume button, or when you pause a button on like a CD or something like that. There's this resume feature, which obviously allows you to resume taking activation requests. Right? So it's pretty simple: pause, resume. Are all of these features command line accessible as well? So that you can, when you say command line, that kind of scares me, but I'll say this. You can go through the COM+ admin SDK, so if you wanted to write a Windows script host script as an idea of command line, you could do something like that to drive the admin SDK, right? But all of these features are accessible. The way you get at the COM+ catalog is via this COM+ admin SDK that sits on top of it, and they have very friendly scriptable interfaces, so you can write scripts and then just double click on scripts, Windows script host or something like that. I just don't want to dive directly into the notion of command line, right? I don't. But you can automate a lot of these processes in a command line kind of way. Okay, is that okay? Cool. So that's how pause and resume works. Okay, so very similar to pause and resume, there's this notion of disable from the perspective that it prevents future activations. The thing that you want to remember, the main difference between pause and disable is that there's actually a place in the COM+ catalog for disabled applications, right? So we can persist the disabled state of an application. So we know we can persist that. You can disable an application, reboot it, and then when that application is restarted, it'll come up in the disabled state. Okay, so that's the difference between pausing versus disabling. If I pause and I reboot, the application starts up in a resumed state. Right? So we don't track the paused status of an application across reboots or anywhere. Right? But the enabling and disabling of an application is actually a property in the COM+ admin SDK that is persisted, so it survives reboots. The status of that value survives reboots. Other fine point differences between the two is that disabling an application works for server and library components, okay, as well as individual COM+ components inside of applications. Right? It still doesn't work with legacy or classic COM components, but they will work for both server and library applications. Process dump, the basic premise here is, you know what, I have some application that I wrote, and I've got my service provider, some third party, somebody else is hosting that application or maintaining that application, and that application dies, right? Something happens that AVs. And then they call you up and say, your application is not running correctly, and you have no place to really start tracking down where this problem is in your application. And the basic premise here is just to provide a dump log of an application without tearing the application's process down, right? And then you can take that dump log back to your shop and back to the developers and have a place to start debugging problems with your application. Right? That's the basic premise. And you use something like WinDebug. So you use existing debug tools to look at these dump logs. And the way process dump works is it's generated by this tool called userdump.exe, which is actually not something that the COM+ team provides. So we just relying on some third-party code that's inside of Whistler. It's a user mode dump tool that actually allows you to walk up to a process, dump the state of it without tearing the process down. Right? So the process can continue to run even after you take these snapshots, these dumped images of the state of the process. Right? So it doesn't invade it, and the process can continue to run. Essentially, that's what user dump does. So the COM+ness of it, right? The COM+ness of process dumping is we automate the process of using user dump. Right? So in the COM+ admin SDK, you can walk up to your application, you can right-click on it, and you can say, I want dump files to go to this particular directory. Okay, and all you specify is the directory and the maximum number of dump files that you want to have in that directory, right? So they don't keep overwriting the same one. Right? So you can specify some number of dump files that you want to have. We'll iterate through them, and then when we reach the end, we'll start at the beginning and do the process all over again. Right? So all you tell us is the path where you want them dumped. We take that path, and then we append to that the name of the name of the complex application plus this sequence number, right? Which one of these dump files is it in the sequence, and that becomes the name of the dump file, right? And then we just write the information there using this user dump tool. Again, this is a service that's provided. You can configure it using the admin SDK. Right? You tell us the dump file path, right? Only the path, no file name specifics, because we generate the file name from the complex application name, right? And then we append that sequence number to it. And then you just tell us the maximum number of dump files that you want to have in that particular directory. Okay? And again, it just avoids overwriting the same file over and over and over. Okay? We do not actually install user dump, right? That'll be actually part of the OS in some way, shape, or form. We don't know if it'll actually be installed, or you'll have to go to tools and install it, right? But we don't install user dump. And we don't do dump file management, right? So if you want to back these up, you want to archive them, you have to do all those things yourself still. We don't automate that process. We simply automate the usage of this user dump tool. And again, you can use these dumps use these dumps in existing debug tools like WinDebug, right? So you don't have to have a new set of tools to come out and be able to analyze this information. Was it a question over here? Nope. All right. The next thing I'm going to talk about, and we'll get to some demos, is this notion of alias components. So when somebody calls co-create instance or create object, they specify a prog ID or a class ID. And essentially that class ID defines some implementation, right? So some DLL on a disk, right? Some particular implementation, as well as some configuration requirements that have been configured in the admin, using the admin SDK in the component services catalog. And when I say configuration requirements, things like, do you require a transaction for your components, right? All of those little settings that you see in the Component Services Explorer, all that information is configuration information about your various components. Right? So when you co-create on a class ID, it's not only that physical DLL implementation, but there's also some configuration associated with that particular class ID. The basic problem that we want to solve is one where, imagine that, how many people here would know what a constructor string is in COM+? Right, or like the constructor string interface. So the basic problem here is, imagine you've got a world where you've got some data services component that essentially takes incoming calls, turns around, and calls some stored procedure. Right, that's pretty common, pretty simple. And the way you select, or the way you connect to the database, is using the constructor string information. Right, so you have a constructor string for that particular component. You go to the COM services admin SDK, specify this connection string information, right? Now when your component is created, you can get that information out, connect to the database, and then at that point in time start delegating calls to these stored procedures. And you'd like to be able to build that functionality, test it, test the goodness out of it, right? And then just reuse it every place in your application, right? As you build more and more applications, you'd like to reuse that existing functionality. But imagine a scenario where you've got that particular component, right? And you want to use it on 10 different applications. Okay, and each one of those applications has a specific constructor string that it uses, right? Here's the problem, right? How do you say, in this particular application's context, right, I have a different set of configuration, right? The same implementation, I want to use the same code that I tested and debugged, the same DLL, but I want to have different configurations, right, depending on the class ID that I created with, right? This is the basic premise of component aliasing. Today, to solve that problem, what we see a lot of people end up doing is they end up cutting and pasting this code into each one of these applications, right, or creating numerous different components by cutting and pasting that code. Right? So you're getting code reuse at a code level, as opposed to you'd really rather compile it and then have a compiled DLL, right, and reuse it at a binary level where you're just saying, here's I want to create a new configuration for that particular implementation, and then provide the configuration details like a new constructor string or some other settings about that particular usage or that particular implementation, that particular configuration. And obviously the benefit here is if I can build up libraries of code that I've already written and tested, right, and reuse them in a binary fashion, well then I have less code to write, I got less code to debug, I got less code to maintain, right, lower development costs, ultimately faster time to market, right. So these are the things that we want to empower people to do. So that's the problem that we want to solve with component aliasing. So again, many class IDs 1 through 4, all sharing a single binary DLL. The little yellow thing is supposed to be the disk, and then I've got, the one real implementation is class ID 1. But here I've got a bunch of aliases that can each have their own configurations, all sharing that same implementation. Right. Is that making sense? Cool. Now it's time for a trusty demo. Go ahead.
Since you have different class IDs there, can you also have different app IDs associated with those class IDs and different things like separate RSNs?
Absolutely. And I'll show you a demo that does exactly that. So, okay, let's see what I'm working with here. I got my VB. So, okay, let's see what I'm working with here. I got my VB. Let's see what I got here. Okay, I got a VB project here. I've got my interfaces defined. And this is essentially the same scenario that I just described. I've got some components that are going to be configured to use a constructor string, right? And then I want to have a bunch of different constructor strings depending on the different applications that I want to use that component in. So what I've done is I've created this interface. I've defined this interface that essentially allows me to walk up to one of those components and just ask it to give me what your constructor string was, okay? And it just gives it back to me as a string. So I just defined an interface here. Then I have my alias server. Right? And so here's an implementation of a particular component that might connect to a DSN and do something. Right? So I obviously implement the iObject_construct interface so I can get the constructor string that was configured for me. Then I also implement that new interface that I just defined so that my little sample app can walk up to this particular component and say, what was your constructor string that was passed into you? I got a private member variable that I use to cache what my constructor string was. So when my component is created, if you look at the iObject_construct implementation, all I do is I get a reference to the constructor string object, right? Because it just comes in as object, iDispatch. So I get a early bound reference to it. Essentially, I QI for that particular interface, right? Then I ask it, what was your constructor string? And I just cache it in this member variable. And then I just clean up. Pretty straightforward. Then in my particular implementation of my IDB component, I just recache I just return whatever the cache constructor string was. Everybody with me? Cool. It's pretty straightforward. So then what I do here is, here's my client piece of code. You provide some class ID, create the object, and then just walk up to it and ask it, what was your constructor string, and it'll display it for you. So create object just uses the regular creation APIs, nothing fancy there. I just cache that connection. So then when a person calls get info, I just display a message box that tells me what the constructor string was using that interface that I defined. Okay, so let's see it in practice. Got the Component Services Explorer here. I'll create a new application. Trusty old wizard. Alias demo. Interactive user. So now I'll install those components. Oops. Okay. Now I go to the alias server component. Get the properties, activation. I'll enable the object constructor, and I'll pass in that this is the original constructor. Okay. And actually, I'm going to copy that prog ID just so I don't type it in wrong. Okay. So now I got a shortcut. And I should be able to just run that client. Oops. Provide the class ID, create the object, get the constructor string, original constructor. No big deal. That's the kind of functionality that we expected. So now I'll destroy that object. Now what I'll do is solve the original problem, which is I've got that functionality, I tested it, I debugged it, and I just want to reuse that in a lot of places so I can delegate to an underlying database, stored procedures, or something of that nature. So instead of cutting and pasting and copying code, what I'll now do is I'll copy that component. Right? And I can copy it. It gives me a list of the destination applications that I want to copy that functionality into. I'll copy it back into the same alias demo application. Tells me the original prog ID. I can provide a new prog ID. So this is exactly your question about I can have a bunch of different prog IDs. Alias server 2, alias server DB component 2. That gives me a new class ID. It generates it automatically. But again, if you run GUID-gen or something like that, and you have a bunch of class IDs that you want to use, you can put that one in here. So if you have a whole bunch of them that are in sequence or something like that, and you want to reuse that, great. So if you know it ahead of time, you can use it. If not, then obviously it'll provide you with one. So here's my new component, DB component 2. If I look at the properties on that one, I will now change this to the copied constructor. Okay. Here's another cool little thing. We can look at the running processes. Right? So now I know that that particular process is running. I can shut it down. Okay, great. So now I'll start 2 instances of that same alias client application. One with the original component and one with now this alias component that we created. Right, so I'll go back to the original one, create that object. Okay, great. When I get the constructor string, I get the original one. Now with this second one, right, I got DB component 2. This is my alias one. When I create that one and get it, then you can see I get the copied constructor. So again, that's the basic problem that we're trying to solve. You've got some functionality that you want to reuse in a binary way, right, as you've got the implementation, but you just need the ability to have a different configuration depending on which customer or which application is going to use it. Right? So here's a classic example of how we can solve that problem using aliases. And again, the benefit is I can reuse this in a binary fashion as opposed to cutting and pasting code. Right? That's the basic premise here. Any questions about what I just showed there? So his question is, assume that this means that you can share the same DLL in different packages, and the answer is somewhat. I'll come back to that in a second. We have some other features that I will show you that address, this is not Fusion, the side-by-side use stuff, but we do have some other things in terms of being able to have many different configurations of a complex application. Right, so here I got many different configurations of a particular component. We also have the ability now to have many different installations and configurations of the same entire complex application on a single box. But that's a different feature, and I will show you that in just a second. Any other questions about just aliasing and what you saw here just now? Does this make sense? Is this a good thing? Is this not a good thing? This is a good thing. I see some heads nodding. This is good. Okay, excellent. Okay, so that's component aliasing. We also had this notion of something that COM developers have been asking for years is this notion to have public and private components, right? Essentially, when you have a component that can be co-created, right, it's just public, right? Anybody that has the appropriate security authorization can create that component and use that component. But there's also times when, you have these helper components that you want to use in the process of building your application, but you never intend to expose that functionality to the outside world. The problem that we have is you can create those, as many of those as you want, and that's great, but you can't, since it's not a public component, you have no way to configure it to use COM+ services, right? It's not public, so you can't get services. Public-private components allows you to have private components that can still show up in the Component Services Explorer so they can still take advantage of some of these new services or any of the services that COM+ provides. Right? So the basic concept is simple. I'm sure everybody gets it, right? Public and private, just like any particular language, VB, C++, right? You have notions of things that are private, things that are public. The scoping is the only thing that might be kind of interesting. We scope it to at the application, at the COM+ application level. So things that are public to the app, anybody outside the app can create. Things that are private, only people inside that application can create that particular component, right? So that's the basic definition of these helper components. You want to use it as part of getting your work done, but you don't intend to expose that functionality. Okay.
References to those private components still be marshaled out of the application.
Absolutely. References.
That also function as a constructor for an internal private component.
So yes, you can pass that back. The only interesting part that I'm not, let me think about that.
Maybe you don't derail the invocation, you just don't allow the activation.
Absolutely. So I'm just trying to think through the proxy stub issues about type library information. I'm not sure off the top of my head whether the private stuff shows up in the type lib. So if you needed to do some kind of remote binding to it or something like that, I'm not sure if it actually provides the marshaling stuff. So you'd have to go probably late bound if it didn't, but I'm not sure off the top of my head.
As long as you have the type lib.
And it shows up in the type lib, right? And it must be because that's where we're getting it from, right? So yeah, I would imagine that would work. You can marshal it out, like if you have some way you can pass it back out, then sure, right? But no, not directly. They couldn't co-create on it. Good question. Okay. So yeah, you see people hack up all kind of ways to create this notion of private components, none of which really work well. So we wanted to add that functionality. People have been asking for it for years, right? So that's pretty straightforward. No surprises. The last thing I'm going to talk about and spend a pretty good deal of time, and I want to have a lot of time for questions for, is this notion of application partitions. Right? And this gets to this gentleman's question about many different configurations of applications. So the first thing that I want to say is that COM+ partitions, what we are partitioning is the application's user base. Okay, so the basic premise is I have one application that different groups of people use differently. For example, I have a test version of my application and I have a production version of my application, right? It's the same physical version, but I have a group of testers that use it with a different set of configurations. Maybe they go to a test database, or I have a training version of my application, right? And I could have these test, training, production versions of my app that have different user bases associated with them, right? That's the basic premise here. On top of that, there are many scenarios where you want to have all of that residing on one particular machine, right? So instead of having 3 different servers, test, production, training, maybe I have one giant, symmetrical multiprocessing box that can handle that load, install all 3 of those apps on one box, right? And now I can manage just that one box as opposed to managing 3 different servers, right? And the problem becomes exponential in a hosting scenario. Right, so if I have an ASP that hosts my COM+ application, and for each one of my customers they have a different DSN that they connect to on the back end, or they have some different configuration about their app, right, and they want to have delegated admins where only their administrators can admin their stuff, right? Today that solution would either require some custom development work, or more than likely what people are going to do is have a different physical server machine for their different versions of their applications, or for each different installation base. Right, for each different partition of their customer base, right? Whether it's the production users, whether it's the test users, whether it's the training users, right? They're going to have different servers, right? So they have a lot more management. Each one of these servers has administrative overhead as well as regular, just cost associated with the box, right? And the basic premise here is that you'd much rather manage a few large boxes than a whole bunch of individual small servers, right? And you can see a scenario where if you got an ASP, for every one of your customers, you may have a different server, right? And that's just not an economical model for a lot of ASPs, right? For some, it's not a problem, but for some, they'd rather have a few giant boxes, right, as opposed to a lot of little ones. That's the basic premise here. So it's 2 things: segmenting of the user base, plus the ability to install and configure applications many different times on the same physical machine. So again, classic scenarios, I might have a test partition, I might have a production partition, I might have a training partition, I might have customer A, B, C, D, so on partitions. Okay? And they represent like virtual machines inside the single physical machine boundary. It's kind of the best way to think about it. Or to think about in terms of these are the users, right? I have test users, I have production users, and then I have training users. Okay. There's also this notion of inheritance, right? Where I have a base partition which represents really the physical machine itself, right? So the production people get the production configuration, but some of those components I might want to just expose in a generic way to anybody that's using them, right? And those will go in the base partition. Right? So the base partition is kind of an inheritance model. If I look inside of my partition, if it's not in here, then I can always jump down to a generic implementation, machine-wide, which is called the base partition. Right? So the basic premise again is when you think about installing applications, I install my complex application onto a machine. Okay, today. Well, tomorrow in the Whistler time frame, if you're using partitions, then what you do is you create a partition and you install applications into partitions, right? And then you have this notion of partition sets, which says these people use these partitions, right? So the partition set is the logical mapping of users to partitions, right? Whereas the partition is kind of like the virtual or the logical machine that you want to install the application into. And again, the whole purpose of this is this allows multiple configurations of your complex app, right, on the same physical box, and to be used by different people, so segmented by user base. Again, this is a lot of what I just kind of talked about. Partitions are grouped into partition sets, so partitions are like the virtual machine. Partition sets is where I say these people use these logical machines, these partitions. Okay. One partition in the set is always marked as the default, right? So when a person calls co-create instance, and we'll get to the activation rules, but when a person calls co-create instance, right, by default, we're going to look at what the default partition is and map them into that, right? We'll look up the user token, look up the user from the token on the user's thread, right? And then we'll use that to look up what partition they go into, find a partition set, and then get the default partition. Right? Alternatively, if you want to specify, I want to create in this particular partition, a particular partition, we'll have a new moniker called a partition moniker where you can specify the GUID for that particular partition and cause activation to go into a particular partition. Right, so there's the default one that you can use, and then there's also explicit usage where you use a moniker. So again, you can map individual users or organizational units to a particular partition set, and users can now obviously only access components from partitions in their set. So again, if you've got for example, Ford and Chevy, or you got a bunch of different partitions on a particular machine, right? You don't want users from one partition being able to access and do things with users in other partitions, right? And so this is just a security thing, right? And everyone can access the base partition. And I don't mean just like willy-nilly, right? You still have role-based security, but everyone has at least access to those components in the base partition. No, that's kind of the point I want to separate out security per se, right? Security is a completely different thing from just do you even have access to activate in that partition. Okay. Okay. So anonymous.
Is there a way to say anonymous activation back on that specific partition?
No, anonymous activations will go through the base partition. Yep. And so that's actually another good question. So another way you'll see this technology manifest is in the IIS scenario, right, where you'll say this particular virtual directory has this user, some user, test user, or production user, or training user, right? And then you'll map that to a particular partition set, right? You'll say that particular user has access to these particular partitions, right? So that'll be another way that you'll see people use partitioning behaviors through ASP. And by just having using virtual directories. So again, just to recap, kind of a visual picture of what I've kind of tried to describe here. I've got machines that have applications installed into partitions, right? I can have many different applications installed into many different partitions. Those partitions go into the partition set, okay? And then I map users, either individual user accounts or organizational users in the Active Directory. I map them into partition sets where I say these people can access these partitions in the set, one of which always has to be the default. So we kind of talked about how does co-create instance behave slightly differently. We have a new property in the context, right, called partition. So we need to know what partition you've already been mapped into. So let's take the scenario where this is the very first activation that's going to cause the application to even be loaded. Right, so at that point in time, there's no partition context available. So what we'll do is we'll establish one. I'm down here at the bottom. If the partition context does not exist, we'll establish it based on the caller's identity, right? So we find out who it is on the thread token, and then we'll search for the default partition for that particular customer. Right? We'll look for their default partition. Okay? Then we'll look for public components in the base partition if we can't resolve the class ID there. So this is how we establish the initial context, the initial partition context for that caller. Right? So from that point in time, you're now scoped to that partition. Okay? So now when you make another co-create instance call, obviously we don't want to jump off into another partition, right? We'd rather stay inside that partition. So what we'll do is when you call co-create instance with a class ID, we'll first search for private components in that particular partition, right? Then we'll search for public components in your current partition, whatever that one is. Okay? And then lastly, we'll look at the base partition, right? So this kind of talks about that inheritance model, right? We'll always jump down to the base partition if we can't resolve a class ID in a particular partition, whether you define it explicitly using a moniker or whether it's kind of defined implicitly using the default partition. Right? So this is the part where we talk about the inheritance. And so here's kind of an example of what that might look like. I got one box here where the COM plus represents that. I got 3 different partitions, partitions 1 and 2, and then the base partition. Right? I've got this library app in the base partition. It has generic components that I want to make available to everybody, right? Class IDs 1 and 5. Now let's look particularly at partition 1 where I have applications 1 and 2. So if you make a call, let's say you're a user that's been mapped to partition 1. And you make a co-create instance call looking for class ID 5. Right? So we will first look inside of that particular partition for a public instance. We don't find any, but we have a class ID 5 in app 2, but it is private, right? The little lollipop inside the boundaries is kind of our demarcation for it's private. Right? So at that point in time, we will jump down to the base partition, and that co-create instance for class ID 5, that activation will actually come out of the base partition. Right? So this kind of is a picture that reflects those rules about how co-create instance works. If you're mapped, that same customer who's mapped to partition 1 calls co-create instance for class ID 1, well, in application 1, we have a class ID 1 that is public, so they'll get the class ID out of application 1, and we won't jump down into the base partition. All right, is that making sense? Go ahead. So if the base partition, if you have some problem with the base partition, will that affect the other 2? Absolutely, it'll affect, those people have references to components in that particular package or that particular application, right? So yes, they will have problems with those particular component implementations. In the back.
Is there any mechanism now in the context framework to get information about the partition you're running in?
Yes, and his question is there any way from inside the application, essentially, right, inside the application to find out what partition are you currently running in? And yes, we have extended the context, so you can reach up in your context and say, give me the partition ID. You'll get a GUID back, and then you can do other things like getting the names and a bunch of other stuff like that. Absolutely. So can the client explicitly say what partition they want to activate in? Yes, you can do that using a moniker. Just like if you're familiar with queued components where you can say queue new and specify that you want to explicitly create a component, a queued component. You can specify a partition moniker where you say partition, the GUID, and then you're going to cause activation to occur explicitly in that particular partition, provided that that partition is part of that user's partition set. Right? So as an administrator, I might say you can use these 2 partitions in your set, right? And you'll see it when I show it to you. If there's another application that's not part of your partition set, then no, you will never be able to get activation in that partition, in that particular partition, even if you use a moniker. Right? So again, if I have a partition set, I might have 5 partitions, right? Only one of which is the default, so I would have to use a moniker to get to any of the other 4. But any outside of that scope, you'd never be able to get to because you just don't have access to them. And you can configure all this in the Active Directory and then kind of push it down to applications in an enterprise. Right? So we will allow you to do that. Other questions, then I guess we'll launch into demos. Go ahead. Excellent question. His question is there a way to map partitions into job objects, the NT job objects, so you could do things like resource utilization, resource partitioning, right? So you can say that this customer has paid more, so they get more access to the processor, they get prioritization and utilization. No, we don't do those things in the Whistler time frame, but those are things that are definitely on the table for the Blackcomb release. So post-Whistler even, we'll look at trying to do those things because we know customers ask for that, and again, it's not just post like that's not just a reporting thing. We don't want to just know who did it, but we also want to have a proactive approach where you can prioritize that these particular customers have higher priority to the processor or any other resource that they're using, database connections, anything else. Right? So we'd love to be able to do that, but we don't in the first version. Other questions? Nope, I guess I'll jump into some demos now. Okay. Okay. Let me destroy these guys. Okay. Okay, so far you've seen me doing some things here. I haven't done anything with partitions, so it kind of looks pretty much the same. I will delete this app. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to view and actually turn on the partitions. Right? Well, not turn it on, but I'll say I want to view it. Okay, so now I'm viewing partitions. Here's the base partition, and essentially everything, all those applications that you saw initially were by default installed into the base partition, right? So now if I expand the base partition and look at the complex applications, you'll see all those applications that you normally look at and associate with the entire machine. So the first thing I'll do is create a new partition, and I will call this production. And I'll create another one called, no, I don't want to do that. Training. We don't need to see that. Okay, so in production and training, there are no complex applications, but I will install my application. I'll install the same application into both partitions. Okay, so I just created the same complex application in the production and training partition. I will furthermore install the exact same components. You can, and it'll depend on, so you want to drag just the DLL on there? The whole package onto, I'm sorry. Yes. You should be able to do that. Let's see. Nope. Apparently not. Well, let's see one more thing. I want to see something. Nope. Although this is an old build. All right, let's see. Well, no, we've seen, no, you can't do that in this particular build. All right, so I'm installing these guys in these different partitions. Great. Now I'll configure them. Activation, I want to enable construction. So this is the production. And then this would be the training. Right, so maybe I have a different DSN that I connect to log training information or what have you. Okay, so that's that basic part there. So now I'll create some partition sets, and these are just the set of people that can use those. So these will be my training users, and these will be my production users. So now into the production, I will say that I want the production partition. So I can, here's the list of the partitions that I want to add to this set. Okay. And then in this training, I will add the training partition. Okay. And inside my partition set, you specify a default. There's always a default partition, right? By default, it's actually the base partition. Okay. So here I'll explicitly say that I want to use the production one as the default partition in that set. And for the training, I'll do the same thing. I want the training partition to be the default in the set. So now I've configured that. Now I'll actually go and add users. So I'll create a couple of users. User A. Yeah, that's great. User B. Okay. So now if I go back, I will say that user A is going to get production. And user B will be my training user. Oops. Cool? Okay. Now, if I go back to my directory here, I've got two little scripts that I wrote ahead of time that essentially allow me to use the run as command so I can run as a particular user. And obviously you can see where I'm going with this. I'm going to run that same alias client as user A, and then the alias client, I'll run it as user B. And you'll see the different, we should pick up the user's identity off the thread token because we're running as that user, and then we have enough information to do the partition mapping. Okay. So I will run user A. No password. Alias server DB. Okay. And user A is in which partition? Production. So obviously I get the production constructor. And if I run as user B, no password, I'll create the exact same component. But obviously it's getting created in a different partition. User B will get the training constructor. Right? So you can see that we're doing exactly what we said we do. It's pretty logical, right? We're partitioning the user base. These users use this version of the application, and you can go further to say that particular version of my application uses, this version of ADO or MDAC stack or other legacy components that you require. You can specify specific versions that they will use. The entire configuration of those applications is at large, right? So you can configure anything to be different about those different partitions. Go ahead.
How does that then fit together with application server? Application center server. When you then take this and you roll it out into a web environment, you load it out like that. So I'm not quite thinking through all the ramifications. Have you tried that yet?
So the question is, how does this impact application center server? So from one perspective, really the only thing that changes is the internal information for how you deploy an application, right? Inside of COM+, right? We'll still spit out an MSI package, right? And then you'll double click that MSI to install it into COM+, but it's a COM+ thing at that point in time, and the application center server doesn't really care anything about it, right? And then the activation is all transparent based on the user ID, right? It could be if you use an anonymous decon, then everybody's going to go to the base partition, which was this guy's question earlier, right? And then if I have a particular ID and it's mapped to, we'll do the right thing to map it, right, at activation. Right, so the actual installation is orthogonal in all ways to App Center Server. Okay. Other questions? Got one? Go ahead. Right. So his question is, if something goes south in the in the production application, it won't affect the other users, and the answer is no. They'll have physically separate process boundaries, right? As well as you can have delegated admin where you can say these people can even view. Let me see if that part is working in this build. Let's see. If I look in the system application in the base partition, right, you can see I can say that these particular, I have different administrators, but the different versions, right? So I can say that these are the people that are going to administer application, these are application A's administrators, these are application B's administrators. So I can have this notion of delegated admin, where only the people in application A, right, they then add their users to that administrator role, right? And then they can only administer, they're only administrators for that particular partition, and it doesn't cross. So we don't have to worry about security conflicts and things of that nature. Right, so the better way to think about when you specify a user in a role is you're saying, you know, this for that particular application, this partition / that role, right? So that's another way to think about the scoping, right? So we have completely separate processes and completely separate administration for those different applications and different partitions. Other questions? Okay. So that's a great question. His question is, from a competitive perspective, is this something that we can do? Is this something that we can do that other app servers cannot do? That's a better question probably for Dino. We have talked to some people to say it's possible to do it, albeit a lot more complex, using different home routes or something like that in EJB. I'm not 100% sure on that, but you might want to talk to Dino. He has a session here specifically about the app server competitive landscape. He might be a better person to ask about that. It's quite similar to that. Great question. Yep. Great. Excellent. Other questions? Yep. That's the Blackcomb story. For those that, just to repeat the question again about if you don't, without the job object, we don't have any way to affinitize or allocate resources to particular partitions, right? We'll be able to do something like that. That's a work item we've got in the Blackcomb timeframe, right? Not just prioritization, but also, you know, resource usage, right? So I want to be able to prioritize as well as monitor who did what on which processes. Because we love to see, obviously you can see the things where you can say, I got higher paying customers that should be able to have, you know, higher priority to all of the resources or what have you, right? As well as being able to do different billing based on who used how much resources and a whole host of other things, right? Then we'd love to be able to get into that. I'm with you 100%, but when this started out, Code Complete was going to be, right, so we get into this whole scheduling thing, right? Code Complete was going to be, you know, January, was going to be what, January, February? Like, do or die, right? We still writing code now, right? So, we would have loved to have gotten it in. Other questions? Okay. I was wondering when that question was going to come up. So the whole .NET strategy, how does COM+ fit into the .NET strategy, right? And I'll give you the short answer, and then I'll point you to a session. Jonathan Hawkins and Shannon Paul actually have a whole session to talk about that in great detail. So to not steal any of their thunder, yet answer your question, the short answer is this. You can build components in the .NET world, right? And they provide all of those tools and the support and the infrastructure for you to build those components. But at the end of the day, when you need services like transactions, other scalable kind of enterprise services, right? We provide those services, right? So we're the COM+ services team. We provide services that you can use with legacy components or in the .NET world. Now today, that's done through interop, right? But one of the things that we're trying to get in is make it where, and probably is not going to happen in V1, but in V2, we're trying to get to a world where the preferred implementation, right? So the optimized case is in the .NET world, right? To try to encourage people to move that route. But it's just not going to happen in the 1.0 time frame, right? So you will still use these services. You'll go into whatever tool you want, build these components, right? You can install those components into the COM+ admin SDK after you run these different tools on them. That's a problem in the PDC bits. I don't know how many people got the bits that were handed out at PDC, but it's really, you got to handcrafted kind of do that. They're going to automate that and facilitate lazy registration, right? So even if you don't register those components with the ComPlus services, by demarcating that it's users transactions or whatever, we have enough information to make the lazy registration, right? So that's some of the things that we're looking to do. That'll be in the beta, right? It's not going to be in, you don't have to wait for version 2 for that. So any other questions, I would encourage you to come up. And other than that, thanks for sticking around, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.